but it is 1 o'clock on the dot, and I'm going to kick off the show. So this is April Prayer. I am a criminal defense attorney in Chicago, and I have been for 22 years. And I always introduce myself at the beginning of the show because I know that every time we have new listeners that have no flipping clue who I am. So with that, we have been struggling to come up with a name for my show. I even put out some feelers on the last show and said I would give away all these prizes, and I got no bites. So I went ahead and came up with my own name. Thank you very much. And it is Laying Down the Law. So Laying Down the Law with April Prayer. And I am so excited to have a guest here today. But before we get to that, we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So this week, I got a huge shock, a great surprise, when I was voted the best lawyer of 2021 by the Chicago Reader. Now, let me take you along for a little journey. So I found out about this, I don't know, mid-January, I want to say, that I had been nominated. But get this, the paper claimed that they couldn't find me. And so I found out 7 days after all of the other nominees. And I'm just like, well, how in the world am I going to catch up? They got a 7-day lead on me. I don't even know who these people are. I don't know how popular they are. Okay, so I just went to work and I started posting on different social media platforms and texting people, please vote for me, and emailing folks, please vote for me, please vote for me. But I didn't think I had a chance at all to catch up, let alone to win. And then I found out the other day that I won. So I'm so excited about that. It's such an honor. Thank you to all who voted. It's really exciting. And I just really want to use it as an opportunity to spotlight the work that I do and the advocacy work that I do outside of the courtroom. And many of you know that I do programs with youth. I do a street law course. I just completed my street law course at Activist. The day before I completed that, I went over to Story Catchers and did a one-off for them. I don't usually like to do one-off workshops, but I did a Know Your Rights workshop. And so I do this, I go into schools, I go to colleges. A corporation even had me on last week to do a keynote about the George Floyd effect. So putting those feelers out there, if any of you can bring me on or bring me onto your platform, that would be awesome. But I do this work and I want to use this award as the opportunity to spotlight that. So in addition to that, I am becoming a recurring guest on Court TV. And this week we talked about some topics that, if I have a chance, I want to talk to with my guest as well. We talked about the so-called, I'm putting in air quotes, the Breonna Taylor trial. And I put it in air quotes because really the trial has nothing to do with her and everything to do with her. Meaning that the gentleman who's on trial, the now disgraced former officer Hankinson, was a part of that raid, but he's not being charged with Breonna's death. So activists are still outraged. There were memes saying that the holes in the wall got more justice than Breonna did, because this gentleman is charged with wanton endangerment for firing through a glass door that was completely covered by not only curtains but blinds, couldn't see it all, into a dark house, and fired anyway. His bullets went through Breonna's apartment, through the wall, into the neighbor's apartment, and almost shot the next door neighbor in the head as he's standing feet away from his stepson who is sleeping. So that is what the trial is about. And we talked at great length about that on Court TV, but Court TV has been a lot of fun because we talk about all the really the craziest cases in the nation, but this was the most notable one of the week. And as far as I know, that trial is still going on, but I'll check into Court TV to see where they're at with that. And then lastly, I want to let you all know I'm launching a new website. So like I said, I do all these speaking gigs, and I realized that my speaking engagements and my programming actually needs a home of its own that's separate from my Justice Junkie website or my Justice Junkie platform on Facebook, where I will specifically devote it to coming into schools and colleges and corporations to speak. And then the Justice Junkie store, and I spell that differently, JUSTUSJUNKIE, will be for merch like my board game, my Shut Up Lawyer Up t-shirts, etc. So with that being said, that was a mouthful, but now I get the opportunity to bring on a legal icon. So I love telling this story, how I knew about this person before I ever met him. And I mean years before. So I'm from Chicago, but I went to law school in Washington, D.C. And when I went to law school, that's when I fell in love with criminal defense and realized that that was the only type of law I wanted to practice, because all the other types were really boring and they were really about paper pushing and not about people. And so I had the opportunity to work with attorneys at the Public Defender Service. And I started off as an investigator while I was in law school, and I would get sent into the jails to actually interact with the clients and to pass messages along from my supervising attorneys to the criminal defendants, all of whom were charged with either murder or kidnapping at the time. And I loved it. And the guys loved me and they appreciated me. And at that time, I started hearing this name over and over and over again, Randolph Stone. And all the attorneys would just gush about how amazing this Randolph Stone guy was and how he had transformed their office. And I was like, because they would say, oh, he's from Chicago like you. And I was like, oh, wow, he's from Chicago. He's in Chicago. He's actually not from Chicago, but he's in Chicago. I was like, oh, okay. And then fast forward, I graduate law school. I moved back home to Chicago. I hear this Randolph Stone name again, because guess what? The public defender's office where I worked in Chicago, which was my dream job, he had been the first African-American to ever head the office, to be the public defender of Cook County. And again, everybody talked about him like he was this living legend and that he had done such amazing advocacy work on behalf of his clients, and he just garnered respect wherever he went. So it wasn't until years later that I went to the University of Chicago. I was invited there to the Mandel Legal Clinic to participate in their intensive trial advocacy program. And that's when I actually started to actually be around Mr. Stone and get to spend some time with him and see how soft-spoken he was and how he was so unassuming and so humble. And I'm like, I'm expecting this big, boisterous, loud person, and he was not at all. And he was very thoughtful and pensive and brilliant. And so I am so excited to bring him on. So the beginning of his career, I thought, was amazing enough. He ran 2 public defender's offices in 2 different states, or DC is not a state, but in 2 different regions of the world, and then came home and then actually spent the bulk of his career, 31 years, at the University of Chicago. And that's where so much of his amazing work got done as a policymaker, as an educator, as he shaped and formed the next generation of law students. So I'm just going to rattle off a few things he's done. So he was co-director of the Mandel Legal Clinic along with Herschella Conyers. He was the he started the Juvenile and Justice, the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Project, the Institute for Juvenile Clinic on Entrepreneurship, the Intensive Trial Practice Workshop that I mentioned, the Civil Rights and Police Accountability Project, and all of those different projects alone had a tremendous impact on juvenile justice, on criminal defense, on policy work. And one of his claims to fame, and I'll ask him what he thinks his proudest moment is, but one of his claims to fame is that he played a hand directly in bringing an end to juvenile life sentences without parole, first in Illinois and then across the US. So with that, I will bring Randolph Stone to the microphone. Thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. And I forgot to say he's retired now and he is living his best life with his wife, Cheryl, and they go all over, hang out with their kids and travel and just, have a wonderful time. And he's really enjoying this season of his life.
Yes, retirement is wonderful. I waited a little too long. I should have retired a few years ago, but I am enjoying it. It's fantastic. I still know how to tie. I'm surprised I still know how to tie a tie. It's the first time I've tied a tie in a couple of years. So it's great.
He is known for his famous bow ties. He wears his bow ties wherever he goes, and that is part of his amazing signature. So I want to dig in and talk about how it is you had an interest in the first place in criminal defense.
Oh, excellent question. When I came out of Vietnam in '69, and several of my friends, we got together and were flirting with the criminal justice system from the defendant's perspective. And that's really what attracted me to the law as it related to that, because a couple of my friends got caught up in it. And I decided to go to law school. I only applied to one law school, university.
We're going to give it a second. I think he's freezing up. And I'm going to have him repeat his answer. Uh-oh. And during the course of my studies, I'm going to stop you because you froze up.
Services program, where I represent. Oh, really? Oh, I'm sorry. I represent.
You froze up. So I'm just going to have you. I'm just going to have you explain your last answer again because you were garbled for most of your answer.
Okay. Well, my first job out of law school.
You said you were flirting with criminal defense because some of your friends had gotten caught up in it after Vietnam.
Right. And then I decided to go to law school. And during law school, I guess my first job out of law school was working with a legal services program, representing people in DC who were being evicted from their homes because of the gentrification process, and people who were subject to high consumer loans. So I did a lot of consumer lending work and eviction work, trying to save people from being evicted. And, you know, that was good work. But then I got a job coming back to Chicago working for the Criminal Defense Consortium of Cook County. And there, the thing that attracted me was being in court almost every day. I liked being in court. I liked the give and take. I liked the opportunity to stand up for people who were in crisis. And so that's what really kind of fueled the rest of them. So where did we stop?
You were talking about you were able to come back to Chicago and that you liked being in court. You liked being on your feet. You liked literally standing up for people. And then you started to get really garbled.
Okay. I'm going to try to lean in a little closer to the microphone and see if that helps.
No, I think it's your connection. So it might just be that part of the house, or it might be, yeah.
This is where I normally do my Zooms, and it's usually pretty stable. So I don't know what the problem is.
We'll just push through. No worries.
Okay, hold on. Let me check one thing.
We'll give a shout out saying, make sure you guys follow my Facebook page, and I'm finally beefing up my Instagram page to do daily really videos on your rights and knowing your rights, and from a criminal defense slant, knowing what to do if stopped by police. And that is Justice Junkie, JUSTUS JUNKIE on both IG and Facebook.
I'm back.
But I think we're good. You ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready now. I switched to a different extender, so we should be better.
Okay, awesome. So you're telling us about standing up on your feet in Chicago, fighting for people, and how you really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and so I decided to continue. As I said, I looked at criminal defense as somewhat of a human rights lawyer type work, which is what I always wanted to do. The opportunity to represent people in crisis in their lowest moment and to kind of stand up for them is what attracted me to the work. And then, as I said, the opportunity to make a change, not only with individuals, but also to change policy, change the course of human events if you get lucky. And it's been a wonderful ride. It was a wonderful ride. I enjoyed it immensely.
So what changed to make you go from being a public defender in 2 major offices in the US, 2 of the best in the US, to then doing the same work, but also being an academic?
Well, yeah, that was a difficult transition for me. The second time I did it. when I left the Cook County PD's office, it was difficult because I enjoyed the public defender work. I thought we were making progress in changing the culture and image of the office. And the people in the office were fantastic. I mean, in my opinion, there is no higher calling for a lawyer than to be a public defender. That's just my personal point of view. You're representing people, like I said, in crisis, people who are in need, people who are sometimes at their lowest point, and you can provide them some hope and some light. But anyway, so I got an offer from the dean of the law school, and I thought it would give me an opportunity to get back in court on a more regular basis. As an administrator in the PD's office, I'm doing purely administrative work. I never set foot in the courtroom almost for all the time I was there, except to visit. And I thought working with students, again, was always a draw. And that I had an opportunity to kind of set up my own program, representing young adults and children who were charged with serious criminal offenses. So it was kind of the best of all worlds. And that's why I left the PD's office. I still considered myself a public defender to some degree because we didn't charge. We represented people who couldn't afford to hire private lawyers. There was a big difference in the sense that we could choose our clients. I thought one of the beautiful dynamics of being a public defender was you didn't get to choose your clients and your clients didn't get to choose you. So it was a kind of a weird dynamic, a dance that you had to play as a public defender. And if you could master that dance, you could be very successful. So that's why I left. Just the opportunity to be a lawyer again, as opposed to an administrator, and to be in an environment where I thought we could make a difference.
Yeah, what you just said about public defenders, one, that they don't get to choose their clients and that the clients don't get to choose us, forces you to build rapport, and it forces you to build trust. And if you fail at both, you're gonna have a very bad reputation and you're gonna have a lot of clients complaining about you to both the judge and to the bar. So, but I wanna piggyback on what you said about a public defender being the highest calling. Because I know, and that's a big part of the reason I brought you on here, is I know that the general public, especially the general public amongst Black folks, have a very low opinion of public defenders. I also, like I mentioned, started in the public defender's office, started off as a public defender intern, and then went to a public defender's office. And it was my dream job. And I have to explain to people that the attorneys who are in the public defender's office are highly vetted. Like, it's a highly coveted position. There's a fight. I had to fight to get into the Cook County office because they were on a hiring freeze, and even then the office in DC would not hire you straight out of law school. So it's a highly competitive position, and I just want you to speak to more about what public defenders actually do and how we can combat this negative view of this calling.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and you know, I'm probably, you know, one of the biggest boosters of public defenders because of the great work that they do and the skill that they have to have in order to be effective to do their jobs. And what I'm seeing around the country is encouraging. You know, there's several different programs around the country that are training public defenders. What the problem that most offices face is the resources. Do you have the resources to do the job that you need to do? Can you control your caseloads? Can you have an opportunity to have good training programs and mentoring programs? Are you subject to judicial whims and pressures? And that's why I think many people have a low opinion of PDs, because of the lack of resources and the high caseloads. What they fail to see is the dedication of the individual lawyers who are working in the programs. So what we can do about it, and what is being done about it, I think, is we're setting up regional training programs around the country for public defenders. You know, when I started out, we used to go to the National College of Criminal Defense, and those programs are expanding. Right now in Washington, when one of the Western states, I think it's Oregon, a public defender is standing up and refusing to accept cases because the caseloads in his district are so high and so overwhelming. So what we're seeing, and people are collaborating with each other. In San Francisco, the DA and the public defenders seem to be collaborating around the idea of providing adequate resources. So we're seeing, I think, a trend towards creating the opportunity for public defenders to have the resources that they need in order to be able to do their job of protecting not only their clients, but protecting the Constitution of the United States. I'm encouraged by what Biden is doing in terms of promoting former public defenders to the bench. You know, we've got a Supreme Court justice nominee now who is a former public defender. First, they say it's the first in the history of the US Supreme Court if she's confirmed. So we're seeing progress. And I think as if we continue to push in these areas, we'll see greater progress. And, you know, one of the things we need to do is encourage our clients, our former clients and their families to be advocates for public defenders, particularly those that have, you know, had some success in the criminal justice system.
Awesome. So you gave me a homework assignment when we were chatting about preparing for this call, and you asked me to look up, rattled off all the things I knew because it took me a whole month to research you for Black History Month. But you gave me a homework assignment to look up the Pontiac 17 case and find out a little bit about it. So I found out a little bit about it, and I also cheated because I talked to our mutual friend X, and he gave me a starting point. That's Xavier Williams. He runs the Activist program where I teach street law, and he's a friend of both of ours. And the Pontiac 17 case arose out of the largest prison riot in Illinois history. And it ended up with at least 10 of those defendants going to trial together, and all 10 being acquitted, which was a huge deal because 9 of them, if they had been convicted, would have faced the death penalty. So I want to talk to you about your role in this historic case, and then we'll talk about some other historic cases that you worked on. But we'll start with the homework assignment that you gave me, the Pontiac 17 case.
Yeah, the reason I suggested you start there is because that case, there were 17 young Black men who were indicted for triple murder, and all 17 faced the death penalty at the time. At the time, that was the largest mass death penalty case in the history of the United States. And the beautiful thing, in addition to the verdict, of course, but the case took months and months to try. You know, there were at least 2.5 months just of jury selection, if you can imagine picking a jury for 2.5 months. And it was you know, it was kind of like a feast and famine situation. Many of the lawyers involved in the case were Black. Some, you know, Leo Holt was, we called him the quarterback of the case. Marianne Jackson was one of the lawyers in the case. Isaiah Skip Gant, Roosevelt Thomas, Lou Myers, Jeff Haas and Michael Deutsch were both involved. There were a lot of very good lawyers. And the problem with the case was it pretty much, most of us were in small firms, and it pretty much destroyed our practice. In fact, at the conclusion of the case, even though we won, many of us were in severe financial distress. But one of the issues in the case was the judge decided to pay the prosecutors a much higher hourly rate than he paid the defense lawyers. And many of us really struggled to try to maintain our practices at the same time that we were trying this case. And, you know, many of the defendants in the case had to return to prison after the verdict because they were serving sentences for other offenses. But some of them, most of them now have been released, and I maintain good contact with a couple of them. Benny Lee was one of the defendants in the Pontiac case, who is now known as a prison advocate and is doing quite well. Albert Jackson is also working for Task and doing quite well. So it was a watershed moment in terms of both the death penalty. It was a watershed moment for a lot of Black lawyers who were involved in the case. And we really got a chance to develop a community of younger Black criminal defense lawyers. And we kind of looked up to Leo as our leader, Leo Holt, who went on to become a judge and himself, and really kind of led the way in that case. But it was a months-long case. The verdict came back on Mother's Day in 1981, and not guilty after some 6 months of trial, and the jury deliberated for, I think, 4 or 5 hours and acquitted each and every defendant of all the charges.
Wow, that's amazing. I wasn't expecting you to talk about the effect it had on private attorneys. I hadn't even thought about that. But yeah, it is difficult and something that isn't discussed often. Number one, we don't usually get selected for the high profile cases.
Right.
People pass us over. This is something I talk about a lot with the Smollett attorneys, about how much of a privilege it was that a celebrity selected them, because for the high profile cases, they normally seek out attorneys who don't look like us. Right. And then to see that the backside of that meant that a lot of you all, your practices were bankrupted because you're in court all day, every day, preparing all night, every night on this case, and couldn't take in new matters, couldn't take on new clients, couldn't appear for new clients. People don't think about that. They just think, oh, you're a lawyer, you must be rich. No, if I'm on trial for 6 months, my whole practice is going to tank. So thank you for sharing that. I want to talk about your work around juvenile justice and what led you to that specific area of criminal defense and all the work that you did around that at the Mandel Legal Clinic.
Yeah, that was a curious sort of initiative for me. As a young lawyer, I always avoided juvenile court. I hated juvenile court. You know, the language was different. You couldn't get a jury trial. We were talking about adjudications as opposed to guilt and innocence. And I avoided the best I could, both in DC. When I got through training, they said, do you want to go to juvenile court or appeals? I said, send me to appeals. And, you know, I loved appeals. You know, I like to write, I like to research, and I said anything but juvenile court. But as I grew and learned, I began to understand how important juvenile court was and how it's really the entry point for a lot of people in the criminal justice system. And it's an opportunity where you can really make a difference in terms of being a mentor and changing people's perspectives and giving them opportunities to look at things differently, and an opportunity to just make a huge difference. So when I got to the university, I thought, let's think about juvenile justice. And also I thought, you know, my fantasy was, you know, I'd have my law students and my juvenile clients, and they'd be skipping down the halls of the law school together, you know, and live happily ever after, you know. That was my fantasy. It didn't quite work out that way, but there was some synergy between the law students and the juvenile clients. They were closer in age, even though their backgrounds were, you know, entirely different. but they did develop some camaraderie and synergy. And we were able to I had a case where my client was charged as a lookout in a gang-related shooting in one of the public housing projects on the near north side. And the students, I said, the first thing I used to tell my students to do when you get a case, find out what the maximum penalties are so that you're able to, what the sentencing ranges are. So you're able to tell the client and the client's family, because that's one of the first things they want to know. And they came back to me and they said, well, if this 15-year-old is convicted, he's going to get life without parole. It's a mandatory life without parole sentence. And I said, no, that couldn't be right. You guys need to go back and do some more research. And they came back and they said, no, he's facing a sort of a triple whammy. He's going to be charged as an adult, he's going to be accountable, and he's facing a mandatory sentence. And that's when we really got involved in, this was in the juvenile life without parole issue. Fortunately, we went to trial with our case and our client was acquitted. But there was another juvenile who was represented by a private lawyer who was convicted. And the judge asked us, our clinic, to do an amicus brief on this question of juvenile life without parole for an accountable defendant. And so we took over that case and wrote an amicus brief. The judge declared the penalty unconstitutional. And the state appealed it to the Illinois Supreme Court. The state appellate defender represented the client, but we wrote an amicus brief to the Illinois Supreme Court. And we got a lot of the juvenile justice groups locally and around the country to sign off on our brief. And to our surprise, the Illinois Supreme Court agreed with us and agreed with the judge and declared the sentence unconstitutional as applied to that particular defendant. So that was one of the first cases in the country where the Supreme Court of a state had ruled that mandatory life without parole was unconstitutional for a juvenile. And we continued to work, and the students did a fantastic job. And I want to emphasize, everything that I've done over the course of my career has been a part of a team. I learned early on to collaborate. Collaboration for me is the key to being a successful professional. You got to collaborate with others. You have to borrow from other disciplines, and you have to use the team concept in order to really be successful. And that's what led us to success in that case. And then we did some work with other jurisdictions, and we ultimately we signed off on the work that Brian Stevens did in the U.S. Supreme Court to declare juvenile life without parole unconstitutional nationally in certain contexts. So that was quite a journey, and we continue to represent juveniles and in a variety of settings to try to ameliorate what was then this push toward, the super predator concept, that these kids were, worthless and needed to be locked up forever, didn't deserve second or third chances. And, I think the clinic as a group, as a team, we were able to do a lot of significant work in ameliorating harsh sentences for juveniles.
Outstanding. That's a historic win. You changed the lives of thousands of people with that one victory. But I like talking in very plain terms, and one term that I hammer home in my board game that you mentioned repeatedly was accountability. And I find that this is very hard to explain to my clients who played a very minor role in a crime that you're getting charged for the same thing as all your buddies. So can you explain to the listeners what accountability is and how you've seen that play out in your practice?
Yeah, it's in many jurisdictions, it's called accomplice liability. Illinois uses the term accountability. And basically what it means is that you are accountable and responsible for the actions of the people that you're involved with. So when, you're in the car and somebody gets out of the car and robs a store and accidentally shoots the person in the store and gets back in the car and you guys all drive off, you're responsible for the robbery, for the murder, for whatever happened, because you participated in the scheme, in the event. And it's a very, my position has always been that as it relates to juveniles, accountability should not apply. That's a concept that should not apply to people under the age of 18, in my opinion, maybe under the age of 21. Because people, as we all know, are subject to peer pressure as kids. Kids do things in groups always. And it just seems to me a legal concept that should apply maybe to adults that over a certain age, but certainly should not apply to children. But that's not the way it is it does apply to children. And you will find, it's kind of similar to the felony murder rule, which we won't go into, but another concept of strict liability where, even though you didn't pull the trigger, you can be responsible for the murder of someone because you're in the course of committing a felony, a death occurred. And so these are strict liability concepts that apply to juveniles and adults. My position is, because what we now know about brain science, what we now know about juvenile maturation, we shouldn't have these sophisticated legal concepts applying to children whose brains are still developing. In a nutshell, that's my position. And I think, ultimately that will be the position that the law takes. It's just going to take time for us to get to that point.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question about the research that you did around the brain science and around international law and their treatment of children and how it's so different here and, how it essentially is a human rights violation. We talked about Standish Willis and his work on other shows, and it's essentially the way we treat children here is so different. But I want to switch gears and talk about how the work that you did with your various clinics also led to bringing justice of a sort to a juvenile decedent. So I want to talk about the work that you did with getting the Laquan McDonald murder tape released and how it is that came to pass.
I can't.
And if you don't know who Laquan McDonald is, for anybody listening, Laquan McDonald was a 17-year-old in Chicago. This is international news, by the way. 17-year-old in Chicago who was shot to death 16 times by Jason Van Dyke. Jason Van Dyke was convicted of his murder and only served 3 years for shooting this boy 16 times. It was on camera. However, the city of Chicago, the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel at the time, all buried the tape and tried to hide it. All the police officers involved wrote false reports that did not make their version of events match what was shown on video at all. So it was a huge scandal when it came out that, dozens of higher ups in the police department and in city government covered this up because this boy was walking away from the police. Yes, he had a knife, he brandished a knife. He was walking away from the police. He was having he was in some type of psychiatric distress at the time, walking away from the police. There were other police officers on site. Nobody even drew their weapon except for Van Dyke, who who then massacred him on the, or killed him on the spot. So with that, how is it that you were able to get that tape released after it was buried for over a year?
Okay, well, I can't take any credit for getting the tape released, but let me back up and say how we got to that point. During the mid 80s and late 80s, we were hearing a lot about people who were charged with crimes being tortured, beaten, just electrocuted, stood next to radiators. And as a criminal defense community, we were hearing a lot about this, but nothing was being done about it. And so when I came back to the university in 91, and started my clinic, one of the things I wanted to try to do was to start a clinic related to police accountability. And because what we were seeing was the private bar who were doing 1983 civil rights work that relates to police accountability, police brutality, were only taking cases, rightfully so, where the damages were significant, because it's very expensive to prosecute a civil rights case. And so the cases that weren't being prosecuted were the minor, so-called minor cases. So when I came back to the clinic in 91, I said, well, let's try to figure out if we can start a clinic where we can represent people who were being abused, but maybe the damages were not extremely, maybe they weren't killed or maimed, but they were still being abused. They were still being treated unfairly. They were still being brutalized to some degree. So that's when we started the Police Accountability Clinic. We hired Craig Futterman to come in and start that clinic. And he's the one, he and his students eventually got to the Laquan McDonald situation and were able to work with a couple community organizers, another lawyer from a private firm, and able to get that video released, which then created this whole thunderstorm of activity and change, including, people will say getting rid of the state's attorney, who was the state's attorney at the time, perhaps, causing our last mayor not to run for re-election, and creating some progress in terms of changing the way police cases in Chicago are treated and processed. So we've come a long way, but we still have such a long way to go. But we've made some progress, and we should be thankful for the progress that we've made. And what's encouraging to me, just like in the Pontiac case, what really got the Pontiac case going was community organizers and people on the street are willing to organize among themselves, come to the court, sit in the court, watch the proceedings, come outside the courtroom and talk to the media about what was going on. Is similar to what's happening today, or what happened during the the George Floyd and the Trayvon Martin, and the way the young people today are beginning to organize and protest and create policy. That's what's really encouraging, and that's what it really takes. The lawyer in the courtroom can do only so much, but you need people outside the courtroom who are educating themselves about the issues, who are organizing themselves in groups, and who are agitating for change, for policy change and policy reformation. So, I'm excited about what's going on today, and I'm optimistic about what's going to happen in the future. But I'm an optimist. So.
I'm gonna push back on one thing that you said, that you didn't have a hand in getting the tape released. You did, because it was you who was the co-director of the Mandel Clinic. It was you who insisted that the clinic not only expand in the work that they did, but also in the physical space. And you hired Craig Futterman. Am I correct? Did I miss something?
Well, like I said, everything it's part of
domino effect.
It's teamwork, you know, it's collaboration. It's the long game and the short game, you know. So I'll take a little credit, but I'm not going to take most of the credit.
All right. So before we wrap, I know that there are some folks on here and they may want to ask questions of you. So I'm going to open up the floor. If anyone has any questions about his phenomenal career and the work that he's done in so many different ways, with juveniles, with criminal defense, with policy work, with education, if you want to chime in. You can just unmute yourself. This is a good question. I want to hear this answer. Have you ever considered a judgeship? This is from Carlotta Bradley.
The answer is no. I've never been interested in being a judge. And I always wanted to be a part of I always wanted to represent clients and not be the referee. So the answer is no.
That was very politically correct. Your answer is much nicer than mine, which is a lot more crass, but the result is the same, a big NO. Are there any other questions? Thank you, Ms. Bradley, for that question. Are there any other questions? Okay. You don't have to post in the chat. You can come off of mute. Yes, okay. Michael Donella.
Yes. May I make a comment? I don't really have much of a question, but a comment. And first of all, thank you for doing this. It provides all of us who are on this and who will see the recording later an opportunity to spend some time with Professor Stone. And it's very valuable. You know, he's always been a very, very busy man, so getting this amount of time with him directly is valuable to all. So let me just say the comment I wanted to make in addition to thanking you for doing this, and that is, my name is Michael. Now I'm a lawyer. Now I'm teaching law in Philadelphia. But the most important thing I want to say is I'm a former student of Professor Stone at the University of Chicago. And even though I have spent, I will say, most of my professional career in the corporate sector as a general counsel, as a chief compliance officer, I've said this to and about Professor Stone many times, and I've said it to many people, and it's still the truth. Despite my corporate career, the most important learning that I got in law school was from Professor Stone. In the criminal defense work, I had the wonderful opportunity to work under his guidance in the Criminal Defense Consortium. And those lessons I learned, and I did some pro bono criminal work after I was in the corporate sector. So I applied it directly there, but all those lessons, kind of looking at the broader, the larger lessons, the sense of justice, of fairness, of excellence, I think it served me, certainly served me well, but I think it also brought something to bear. So, all those things like inside the corporate world, that we don't normally think of. And I've had some corporate criminal cases too, but most of it's been, kind of the normal sort of business. I consider myself a business lawyer. There's a lot of stuff that goes on within corporations that affects people in terms of justice, fairness, process, and like I said, the most important lesson I got. Lessons, I can't say lesson, and lessons was from Professor Stone. So thank you.
Hey, thank you, Mike, and thanks for joining. My old ethics professor used to say, if you don't want to have clients who lie, cheat, steal, and murder, don't go into corporate law.
That's true. That's true. But you you can easily add that you don't want clients, in addition to all that stuff, who are just arrogant and stupid. They may not think they're lying, but they can be arrogant, they can be stupid and do a lot of that stuff because they just the arrogance, I think, leads people to think that their sphere of knowledge, as narrow as it may be, is all that there is to know about something. Right. And that's just something else. Going back to Randolph Stone, where he is, you might know some very important stuff, some very nice stuff, but it's not necessarily all there is to know. So again, it's a big thing. And also, I'm even now. Let me just add to this. I said I've been in the corporate world for 43 years as a professional. I don't look like it now. I'm wearing a hoodie because we are. I'm teaching at Temple University, and we're spring break is next week, so I'm taking an early start on spring break. I've unlike what goes on now, where people have lots of different jobs. I've only really had 4 jobs so I've spent long periods of time at all of the organizations that I've worked with, and every single one of them, I got the job with a recommendation from Professor Stone.
Wow.
So I'm just that's for students out there. And again, I still believe that the corporate law, and particularly criminal defense law, is one of the most important things there is. It's I went into a different area, but I just, when I mentioned the recommendations got me my jobs, it's for students that are out there. Keep that in mind. It's the knowledge. It's not necessarily the specific area to which you apply it. And take that knowledge where you can get it. And if you're blessed, as I was, take advantage.
Thank you. That was so beautiful. I think that also speaks to, it's not just the knowledge, it's the relationships, which is also what Randolph Stone talked about earlier, is teamwork. But I want to end with the question from, is it Mylan Patton? She wants to know, what do you want your legacy to be?
Wow. That's quite a question to ask somebody. I suppose Mylan is a young man who's I think a junior in college that I met about a month ago, because he's thinking about going to law school. So we've been talking about law school. I think I've never thought about what I wanted my legacy to be. But if I had to come up with something, I suppose it would be someone who was always trying to improve, trying to be a better husband, a better lawyer, a better father, a better brother, a better friend. That's kind of what I think about. How can I be better? How can I do things better and make a difference?
Awesome. So on that note, I'm going to thank you so much for joining me. Randolph Stone has been a complete joy to share just a little. I mean, we'd be on here for days talking about your actual journey, but just to touch on some of the highlights and to see how varied a law career can be even focusing mainly in one area of law, and that being criminal defense. And by now, if you all know nothing else about me, I absolutely love lawyers who both practice and teach, because I think that teaching is a big part of our calling. And I actually got that from Lou Myers. I was privileged enough to do a trial with him. But I noticed that most of the attorneys that I truly admire, the Black attorneys I really admire, are also teachers. And I think that's so important, to not just hoard your knowledge or just use your knowledge for profit, but to share it with others. But with that, next month, I have already booked my guest, which I've never done this early before. I'm actually getting on the ball. But I want to talk about another social justice warrior who's in a completely different realm. She's in the realm of reproductive rights, and her name is Sharice Scott. Sharice and I have been friends for, I don't know, 25 plus years. We knew each other from the poetry scene. I used to be a performance poet, and she is one of the most gifted vocalists I've ever heard in my life. And she moved from Chicago down to Tennessee, which I believe she might be from originally. And so you can imagine how difficult it is to talk about abortion and right to reproductive health and services in the heart of the Bible Belt. And she is facing, she actually went up against the Tennessee Senate and gave testimony. And I guess they didn't like what she had to say, so they cut her off mid-sentence, cut her mic off. So we look forward to talking to Sharice Scott on the next call. I will have her on. We will also do a Zoom at the same time so that you can see her lovely face, and maybe I'll get her to even sing a couple notes for us. And then someone is asking me in the chat, where can you get my game? My game is a game which teaches you about police encounters, how to make it home alive after interacting with police. It goes over 54 different real life scenarios that I've seen in my own practice that, you know, I'm sure Randolph will tell you the same. You see the same patterns over and over and over again. Either it's going to be a search, or it's going to be a raid, or you see the same patterns over and over, whether the person has guns or drugs or whatever the crime is. And so I put those patterns into 54 different real life scenarios that can save your life. The game is called Trials and Triumph, and that can be found at justicejunkie.store. Justice is spelled a little bit different because there's a saying, there is no justice, there's just us. So I spell it JUSTUSJUNKIE.store. And that's the same place you can follow me, Justice Junkie, at on both Facebook and Instagram. But with that, I'm going to close out my new show, which I finally gave a name to, which is, I almost forgot that fast, Laying Down the Law with April Prayer, and my special guest today, professor, attorney, visionary, icon, legend, Randolph